I'm Nala Ayed. Welcome to Ideas and to the first of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society by world-renowned Internet communications and security expert Ron Deibert. We've got a problem. The Internet, the great tool that was supposed to put information at everyone's fingertips and make the world a whole lot better, has been taken over by forces that seem beyond our control. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert explores what went wrong and what we might do about it. Ron Deibert is director of Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, a research group that focuses on digital threats to human rights and civil society. They've investigated cyber attacks against Mexican journalists, disinformation spread by Iran, and the hacking of the Democratic Party emails in 2016. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert ranges over many of the issues that plague the Internet and social media. The latest insights into the psychology of marketing and the hacking of human behavior are being used to turn us into addicts. Our personal data is being vacuumed up, turning us all into products for sale. Governments in general and malign players in particular are using social media tools against us as a weapon. And the question is, what is to be done? There's no Massey Lectures tour this year, but we've assembled a panel to comment on what Ron Deibert is talking about. Some of the people you'll hear from time to time through the programs are writer and filmmaker Astra Taylor, human rights lawyer Chinmayi Arun, philosophy professor Tamsin Shah, journalist and author Misha Glenny, former Google executive Meredith Whittaker, journalist and author John Naughton, and political scientist Daniel Dewdney. On Ideas, here's Ron Deibert with the first of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures.
This is Lecture 1. Look at that device in your hand. Part 1, the crisis we're in. Look at that device in your hand. No, really, take a good long look at it. You carry it around with you wherever you go. You sleep with it, work with it, run with it, you play games on it. You depend on it and panic when you can't find it. It links you to your relatives and kids. You take photos and videos with it and share them with friends and family. It alerts you to public emergencies and reminds you of hair appointments. Traffic is light. If you leave now, you will be on time. You depend on it for directions, weather forecasts, and the news. You talk to it, and it talks back. You monitor the appliances that in turn monitor your house and you with it. You book your flights on it and purchase your movie tickets through it. You order groceries and takeout and check recipes on it. It counts your steps and monitors your heartbeat. It reminds you to be mindful. Use it for yoga and meditation. But if you're like most everyone I know, you also probably feel a bit anxious about it. You realize it, and what it connects you to, is doing things to your lifestyle that you'd probably be better off without. It's encouraging bad habits. Your kids and even some of your friends barely talk to you in person any longer. Sometimes it feels like they don't even look you in the face, their eyeballs glued to it, their thumbs tapping away constantly. Your teen freaks out when the device rings. You mean I have to actually speak to someone? How could something so social be also so curiously antisocial at the same time? You check your social media account and it feels like a toxic mess, but you can't help but swipe for more. Tens of thousands, perhaps millions of people actually believe the earth is flat because they watch videos extolling conspiracies about it on YouTube. Right-wing, neo-fascist populism flourishes online and off, igniting hatred, murder, and even genocide. No doubt you've also noticed that social media have taken a drubbing in recent years. The gee whiz factor has given way to a kind of dreadful ennui. Your daily news feeds fill with stories about data breaches, privacy infringements, disinformation, spying, and manipulation of political events. Social media executives have been dragged before congressional and parliamentary hearings to face the glare of the cameras and the scrutiny of lawmakers. The 2016 Brexit referendum and the 2016 U.S. election of President Donald Trump were both major precipitating factors behind the re-examination of social media's impact on society and politics. In both cases, malicious actors, domestic and foreign, use social media to spread malfeasance and ignite real-life protests with the intent to foster chaos and further strain already acute social divisions. Thanks to investigations undertaken in their aftermath, shady data analytics companies like Cambridge Analytica have been flushed out from the shadows to show a glimpse of social media's seamy underworld. Then there's the real dark side to it all. You've read about high-tech mercenary companies selling powerful cyber warfare services to dictators who use them to hack into their adversaries' devices and social networks, often with lethal consequences. First, it was Jamal Khashoggi's inner circle. Then, allegedly, Jeff Bezos' device. Maybe I've been hacked too, you wonder to yourself, suddenly suspicious of that unsolicited text or email with an attachment. The world you're connecting to with that device increasingly feels like a major source of personal risk. But it's also become your lifeline, now more than ever. When the novel coronavirus swept across the globe after its discovery in Wuhan, China in December 2019, business as usual ground to a halt. Entire industries shuttered, employees laid off in the millions, and nearly everyone forced into self-isolation and work from home. While all other sectors of the global economy were on a rapid downward spiral, the large technology platforms saw use of their services skyrocket. Video conferencing tools like Zoom went from obscure office contrivances to something so commonplace your grandparents or children used it, often for hours on end. Netflix, Amazon Prime, and other streaming media services were booming, a welcome distraction to the grim news outside. Bandwidth consumption catapulted to such enormous levels that telecommunications carriers were putting caps on streams and downgrading video quality to ensure the internet didn't overload. Miraculously, it all hung together, and for that you are grateful. But the global pandemic also accentuated all of social media's shortcomings. Cybercrime and data breaches skyrocketed as bad actors capitalized on millions of people working from home, their kitchen routers and jerry-rigged network setups never designed to handle sensitive communications. In spite of efforts by social media platforms to remove misleading information and point their users to credible health sources, disinformation was everywhere, sometimes consumed with terrible effects. People perished drinking poisonous cocktails shared over social media and endorsed by Donald Trump himself in a desperate attempt to stave off the virus. The entire situation presented a striking contrast both to the ways in which social media advertise themselves and to how they were widely perceived in the past. Once, it was conventional wisdom to assume that digital technologies would enable greater access to information, facilitate collective organizing, and empower civil society. The Arab Spring, the so-called colored revolutions, and other digitally fueled social movements like them seemed to demonstrate the unstoppable people power unleashed by our always-on, interconnected world. Indeed, for much of the 2000s, technology enthusiasts applauded each new innovation as a way to bring people closer together and revitalize democracy. Now, social media are increasingly perceived as contributing to a kind of social sickness. A growing number of people believe that social media have a disproportionate influence over important social and political decisions. Others are beginning to notice that we are spending an unhealthy amount of our lives staring at our devices, socializing, while in reality we are living in isolation and detached from nature. As a consequence of this growing unease, there are calls to regulate social media and to encourage company executives to be better stewards of their platforms, respect privacy, and acknowledge the role of human rights. But where to begin? And what exactly should be done? Answers to these questions are far less clear.
So this is Astra speaking. It's interesting to me listening to these comments because actually there was such romanticism and enthusiasm and techno-utopianism in the early days of social media. It's quite striking how dark people's feelings have become in quite a short span of time. But what I do like about this call is the emphasis on regulation, because I think we do need a social and public approach to this problem. This is not something that can be solved simply through individual action, through abstention, through saying, okay, I'm not going to personally be on Facebook. This is just about me and my relationship to my device. This is a much bigger problem. This is not something that we as individuals can handle or resolve on our own. So we have to look at multiple things. We have to look at the structures of technology, how they're being designed. These tools are addictive by design. Their business model is driven by clicks. And so they need to keep us constantly engaged. But that's not happening in a vacuum. That's happening in a social context where there's increasing loneliness. Loneliness is off the charts in advanced democracies. So people are turning to their phones, to technology as a form of solace. That's a social problem. People are increasingly insecure in their lives, insecure economically, insecure politically. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for connection. And so those are things we have to solve together. It has to go far beyond just thinking about our relationship to our phones or specific social media problems.
Part 2, The Common Danger. The title of these talks, Reset, is intended to prompt a general stock-taking about the unusual and quite disturbing period of time in which we find ourselves. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, Martin Luther King Jr. once famously observed. Looking around at the climate crisis, deadly diseases, species extinction, virulent nationalism, systemic racism, audacious kleptocracy, and extreme inequality, it's really hard to share his optimism. These days, it feels more like everything's all imploding instead. If there has ever been a time when we needed to rethink what we're collectively doing, this is certainly it. More specifically, the title is also intended to signal a deeper re-examination of our communications ecosystem that I believe is urgently required now more than ever. In the language of computers and networking, the term reset is used widely to refer to a measure that halts a system and returns it to an initial state. The term reboot is often used interchangeably. A reset is a way to terminate a runaway process that is causing problems and start over anew. Users of Apple products will be familiar with the spinning beach ball that signifies a process that is stuck in a loop, while Microsoft customers will no doubt recall the blue screen of death. We've all been there at one time or another. The term reset is also used more broadly to refer to a fresh start. As when parents tell their children to take a timeout, a reset is usually suggested when something we're doing has become counterproductive and deserves some reconsideration. It's also common to think about a reset when we do something entirely novel, like begin a new job or move to a new house. Resets allow time to regroup, clean house, take stock and look at the big picture, and launch a new plan. In broader parlance, a reset implies beginning again from well-thought-out first principles. It allows us to discard the errors of the old ways of going about things and start over with a solid foundation. Not that long ago, and I mean within my adult life, we used information and communications technologies self-consciously and as deliberate one-off acts. We made a telephone call. We watched television. We listened to the radio. We dropped a letter in the postbox. Later, we composed essays or undertook calculations on our desktop computers. These were all relatively self-contained and isolated performances, separate from each other and from other aspects of normal life. But beginning around the 1980s, at least for those of us living in the industrialized West, things began to change quickly. Those desktop computers were eventually networked together through the internet and internet-based subscription services like CompuServe or America Online. In 1991, the World Wide Web brought a kind of technicolor to the internet while unleashing a dramatically new means of individual self-expression. Thanks to improvements in cellular technologies and miniaturized transistors, telephones went mobile. Before long, Apple gave us the iPod in 2001, onto which we could download digital music. The iPhone, released in 2007, combined the two, and then integrated their various functions via the internet, producing a one-stop, all-purpose, mobile, digital, networking, smart device. Before long, the internet was in everything, from wearables and network kitchen appliances, all the way down to the molecular level with digitally networked implants like pacemakers and insulin pumps. Digitally networked neural implants that are presently used for deep brain and nerve stimulation, as well as to enable mind-controlled prosthetics, are merely at the rudimentary stages of development. Engineers are experimenting on systems involving thousands of tiny speck-sized neural implants that would wirelessly communicate with computers outside the brain. Whatever the future brings, we are all now cyborgs, a term that once described a hypothetical fusion of human and machine. One can no longer draw a clear separation between our normal and our digital lives, or, to use older lingo, between meat and virtual spaces. Our use of information and communications technologies is now less a series of deliberate, self-conscious acts and more like something that just continuously runs in the background. Much of it is rendered invisible through familiarity and habituation. Disparate systems have converged into an always-on, always-connected mega-machine. This profound shift in how we communicate and seek and receive information has occurred largely within the span of a single generation. To be sure, there is still vast digital inequality. Nearly half the world's population is yet to come online, but those gaps are closing quickly. The fastest growth in mobile internet connectivity is in the global south, as entire populations leapfrog over older legacy systems and fixed line connections to plug directly into social media using mobile devices. But the uses towards which those populations, and all next-generation users for that matter, are putting digital technologies are sometimes quite surprising and different than what the original designers intended. Human ingenuity can reveal itself in many unexpected ways. The internet gave us access to libraries and hobby boards, but also gave criminal enterprises low-risk opportunities for new types of global malfeasance, like spam, phishing schemes, and more recently, ransomware and robocalls. Early in the internet's history, many assumed the technology would hamstring dictators and despots, and to be sure, it has created some control issues for them. But it's also created opportunities for older practices to flourish, such as the way kompromat, Russian for compromising material used for blackmail and extortion, has taken on new life in post-Soviet social media. The entire ecosystem was not developed with a single well-thought-out design plan, and security has largely been an afterthought. New applications have been slapped on top of legacy systems and then patched backwards haphazardly, leaving persistent and sometimes gaping vulnerabilities up and down the entire environment for a multitude of bad actors to exploit. It's all an accidental megastructure, as media theorist Benjamin Bratton aptly put it. The global communications ecosystem is not a fixed thing, is not anywhere near stasis either. It's a continuously evolving mixture of elements, some slow-moving and persistent, and others quickly mutating. There are deeper layers, like those legacy standards and protocols that remain largely fixed. But caked on top of them are a bewildering array of new applications, features, and devices. Weaving through it all are rivers of data, some neatly contained into proper channels, others pouring through the cracks and crevices and spilling out in the form of data breaches. The phrase, "data is the new oil," refers to the value to be gained from all of the data that is routinely harvested by machines from both humans and other machines. The entire complex, bristling with millions of pulsating, data-sorting algorithms and sensors. The gradual rollout of fifth-generation cellular technology, known as 5G, will dramatically increase the speed and broadband capacity of cellular networks, fueling an even greater volume of data circulating from a larger number of network devices. The combined effect of each of us turning the most intimate aspects of our digital lives inside out has created a new emergent property on a planetary scale that has taken on a life of its own, derived from but separate from us, a data sphere.
Hi, Tamsin Shaw here. I think that idea of ordinary life and digital life blurring is very true. So Mark Zuckerberg claims that he wanted just to connect people, but he's not doing just that with Facebook, because I think when we're online on those platforms, we're not our full selves. I would liken it to being an avatar in a video game where you have a very narrow set of moves. So if you think about somebody posting about a bereavement, you might click a sad face emoji, type a brief comment, and that's your engagement with their grief. Of course, if it's somebody you know well, there'll be something else. But if it's a stranger, that's all there is. Whereas in real life, if you met a stranger who'd been recently bereaved, it would probably be an awkward situation where you wouldn't quite know what to say. And that awkwardness is a really healthy thing, because that's what makes us reflect on what it might like to be in their shoes and what it might be appropriate to say. And that gives us more self-understanding, more understanding of other people. And online interactions just really don't deepen our understanding of one another in that way.
You're listening to the first of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures by Ron Deibert. Look at that device in your hand. This is Ideas in Canada on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM across North America, in Australia on RN, and around the world at cbc.ca/ideas. I'm Nala Ayed. It's looking as if the internet and social media have been taken over by extremists and bad actors. We've all been turned into addicts. Our personal data is being stolen and sold to the highest bidder. We're spied on and surveilled by foreign powers, and the phones and tablets we're all using are polluting the planet. So how do we get back control? On today's program, Ron Deibert maps out the challenge and the journey we'll be taking in our series, a journey through the labyrinth of social media and an online world that was unimaginable only a generation ago. This is the first of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. Here's Ron Deibert.
Part 3. Anti-social media. Social media, strictly understood, refers to the breed of applications that emerged in the last decade and a half, thanks largely to the extraordinary business innovations of Google and Facebook that gave rise to what the political economist and business management professor Shoshana Zuboff has termed surveillance capitalism. Merriam-Webster defines social media narrowly as forms of electronic communication, such as websites for social networking and microblogging, through which users create online communities to share information, ideas, personal messages, and other content, such as videos. But missing from this definition is the underlying business model, an appreciation for which is essential in order to fully understand the dynamics of social media. At their core, social media are vehicles for the relentless collection and monetization of the personal data of their users. Social media are so overwhelming and omnipresent in our lives, it may feel like they've been with us forever. Some of you listening to this may have grown up entirely within the universe of Facebook, Google, Snapchat, and TikTok, and not know what it's like to live without them. I'm among those living generations that have experienced life before and after social media. I remember standing in a long line with nothing to do but think. Social media do not stand alone. They are embedded in a vast technological ecosystem. In order to participate in social media, you need some kind of network device, a smartphone, tablet, laptop, or PC. Those devices send electronic signals through radio waves or cables that are transmitted through a physical infrastructure of routers, servers, cell towers, and data farms, in some cases spread through multiple countries. Each of these elements is operated by numerous businesses, which can include internet service providers, cable companies, cell service providers, satellite services, undersea cable providers, and telecommunications firms, as well as the various hardware and software manufacturers supporting them all. Which companies operate the various components of this ecosystem, and according to whose rules, matters enormously for users' security and privacy. The internet, telecommunications, and social media are so foundational to everything else that they have become an object of intense geopolitical competition among states and other actors on the world stage. Cyber commands, cyber forces, and electronic armies have proliferated. A large, growing, and mostly unaccountable private industry feeds their needs with tools, products, and services. The struggle for information advantage is a byproduct of seemingly endless opportunities for data exploitation as a consequence of pervasive insecurity. Defense is expensive and difficult, so everyone goes on the offense instead. The ancient art of intelligence gathering is now a multi-billion-dollar worldwide industry that snakes clandestinely through the catacombs of the planet's electronic infrastructure. To give one illustration of the magnitude of the issue, Google's security team says that on any given day, it tracks around 250 government-backed hacking campaigns operating out of 50 countries. And yet, in spite of it all, the communications ecosystem somehow hangs together. Interdependence runs deep. Even closed-off North Korea depends on the internet for illicitly acquired revenues. And so most of the offensive action, even among otherwise sworn adversaries, takes place just below the threshold of armed conflict. Subversion, psychological operations, extortion through ransomware, and digitally produced propaganda is where the real action is to be found. Less violent, to be sure, but no less destructive of the health of the global communications sphere. The entire ecosystem requires enormous energy to power, and that in turn implicates all the various components of the global energy grid: power stations, transmission systems, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants, coal-fired power plants, and others. The awesome speed with which we can send and retrieve even large amounts of data tends to obscure the vast physical infrastructure through which it all passes. Last year, my family and I did a FaceTime video call between Sydney, Australia, and Toronto, Canada, which at roughly 15,500 kilometers apart are about as distant as 2 points on Earth can be, and it works seamlessly. as if it were some kind of magic. But it's not magic at all. It's physics. However immaterial they may seem, our digital experiences rest on a complex and vastly distributed planet-wide infrastructure. To be sure, it's not all physical. This enormous communications ecosystem could not function without rules, protocols, algorithms, and software that process and order the flows of data. Many different terms have been used to describe this entire ecosystem: the Internet, cyberspace, the World Wide Web, and more. But because these can quickly date themselves, I prefer to use the more generic term, communications ecosystem. It's important to make this distinction clear, because while we may want to eliminate or temper some of the characteristics of social media, we do not necessarily want to, nor realistically can we, eliminate the vast communications ecosystem of which they are a part. Looking only narrowly at the effects of social media proper may also obscure some of the consequences connected to the broader and continuously mutating communications ecosystem. There is no shortage of blame placed on social media for all sorts of social and political pathologies. But assigning causality, in a scientific sense, to social media for any particular outcome, negative or otherwise, is not always simple given the extensive ecosystem of which it is a part. Sometimes doing so is more manageable, such as through rigorously controlled and peer-reviewed experiments on the effects of digital experiences on human cognition and behavior. It is from studies such as these that we are beginning to understand some of the addictive qualities of our digital experiences, which may help explain the panic you feel when you lose that device. But higher-level effects, for example, the impact of social media on political polarization or authoritarianism, are far more difficult to untangle from other confounding variables, to use the language of social science. Societies are complex, and monocausal theories about them are almost always incorrect. Some of the effects people may attribute to social media, for example, decline of trust in public institutions, are almost certainly the result of multiple overlapping factors, some of which reach back decades. Attributing causality at a massive scale is always tricky for that reason.
It's Misha Glennie here. I was intrigued by what you were saying about fake information. Of particular interest to me is why social media makes this all so different. And for me, it comes down to a simple question of scale, that you can simply spread information much further and wider. I mean, it's on an incomprehensible scale now that we have social disinformation. And once people became aware of what you could do with that, then governments, corporations, and other interest groups realized that this was a tool they could use to great effect. If you look at somewhere like Russia, remember it has an economy which is 10 times smaller than the United States, and it doesn't have the demographic, the economic, or the social capacity to maintain parity with either the US or China, its two main potential rivals. And so instead it looks at the weaknesses of its rivals. In particular in the West, it can see that democracies are insecure at the moment, and it costs very, very little to intervene in the democratic processes malevolently for a country like Russia. So why wouldn't they do it? And it's particularly effective if we remember that the internet has undermined the economic basis of the free media. So it's now impossible to fact check everything that you're reading and consuming, and it is very, very easy to manipulate. So that issue of scale seems to me to go to a lot of the questions that you're addressing.
This is Meredith Whitaker here. What I love about the way Ron frames this is that he takes a historical lens And then he recognizes that these disinformation efforts are well resourced, that what you're seeing are people who, in another context without social media, may have also tried to spread disinformation. But because they have figured out how to game these platforms, how to disseminate this information on these platforms, they are targeting their disinformation efforts through these platforms. What he's connecting here is the fact that these are organized efforts and that we have to look at the politics and the players behind this disinformation to understand specifically what is happening in this ecology, that we can't simply paint algorithms and social media platforms as magical and as capable of hijacking our brains.
Part 4, The World Brain. In what is certainly an ominous decision, but one with which it is hard to argue, in January 2020, the esteemed Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists set their widely referenced doomsday clock, a symbol representing the risks of human-caused existential catastrophe, 20 seconds closer to midnight. Although they cited a number of factors, one that stood out was their concern about the toxic information environment in which we find ourselves, which they concluded had deteriorated to the point of being a public safety hazard. Said the bulletin's editors, quote, "Continued corruption of the information ecosphere on which democracy and public decision-making depend has heightened the nuclear and climate threats." It's hard to argue with them on that point. What happened here? Information and communications technologies are, in theory, supposed to help us reason more effectively, facilitate productive dialogue, and share ideas for a better future. They're not supposed to contribute to our collective demise. Writing at the cusp of the Second World War and terrified by the awesome destructive military power the great powers were about to unleash on each other, H.G. Wells described an imaginary world encyclopedia, or world brain, that humans might one day engineer, which would greatly contribute to resolving our endemic conflicts. Wells wrote, "The whole human memory can be, and probably in a short time will be, made accessible to every individual. The world brain need not be concentrated in any one single place. It need not be vulnerable as a human head or human heart is vulnerable. It can be reproduced exactly and fully in Peru, China, Iceland, Central Africa, or wherever else seems to afford an insurance against danger and interruption. And its creation is a way to world peace that can be followed without any very grave risk of collision with the warring political forces and the vested institutional interests of today. Quietly and sanely, this new encyclopedia will not so much overcome these archaic discords as deprive them steadily but imperceptibly of their present reality. A common ideology based on this permanent world encyclopedia is a possible means, to some it seems the only means, of dissolving human conflict into unity. The essay has always fascinated me. It's hard not to see what Wells describes as something we have indeed already accomplished. What is Wikipedia, if not the very world encyclopedia that Wells envisioned? Always on, accessible to virtually anyone living anywhere on the planet who has internet access. The whole human memory, the storehouse of our collective wisdom, accessible to every individual. But Wells was clearly mistaken about how the world brain would affect change. Rather than dissolving human conflict into unity, our world brain seems to be tearing us apart. Rather than facilitating the emergence of a common ideology based on science, social media are spreading ignorance and falsehoods, polluting the public sphere, and subjecting us to wholesale surveillance. The nerves of our world brain are vibrating with full-on assaults on truth, science, ethics, and civility. It's a perfect storm. Tools that enable precise details about people's preferences and habits. Sophisticated machines that can swiftly analyze and then manipulate data as points of leverage around human emotions. Unethical companies willing to do anything for a profit, and clandestine government agencies that lack public accountability but do have big budgets and a blank check to use social media as an experimental laboratory for their dark arts. The potential implications of this perfect storm should be profoundly unsettling for everyone concerned about democracy, the public sphere, and human rights. To be sure, we need to avoid mythologizing an imagined state of affairs where truth and democracy reign supreme. This never actually existed. Media throughout history have been biased in important ways and manipulated by outside actors and have served the interests of powerful elites at the expense of democratic engagement.
This is Daniel Dudney. I think that Wells is a great baseline to think about how terribly awry things have gone. Wells was really a high modernist and the Enlightenment in its next stages, and has a vision of this encyclopedia that will be authoritative in character. And there's a presumption of expertise and authoritative knowledge that then would be unified and made available to everybody. And when one looks at what's happened with the internet, everything's been made available to everybody, but there is a complete disintegration of the unifying standards and the role of expertise in vetting knowledge. Remember that the great promise of the internet was that it was going to give everyone, in effect, a microphone, give everyone a voice. And basically, that's happened to a large degree. And the problem is that most people don't have anything to say. And there's a vast cacophony of whatever, that there's no filtering mechanisms anymore. And it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Hi, I'm John Norton, and I often describe myself as a recovering utopian because I thought that my generation, the generation that built the internet, had invented a technology that was more empowering and democratizing than anything since the invention of print, and maybe even before that. And in a sense, I think we were right. The technology has all those amazing affordances. But I think what we failed to appreciate was the power of corporations, of private corporations, and to some extent governments, to capture the technology and use it for their own purposes. And I guess we were also a bit over-optimistic about the capacity of our fellow humans to seize and exploit the affordances of the technology for human flourishing. We thought that the internet meant, in a way, the end of the couch potato, because it was a medium that enabled people to create things for themselves. And guess what? Actually, what's happened is that instead of that, we have an internet that's largely been converted into billion-channel TV. And that's a big disappointment to us because we didn't think that would happen.
Part 5, The Turning Point. Who knew that as social media climbed in popularity and more people acquired always-on mobile devices, these would prove to be a major source of insecurity exploited by autocrats and other bad actors? Who could have foreseen that a tool designed to forge bonds between communities would end up fostering social polarization and discord? Media ecologists remind us that changing technological environments can take human history in unexpected directions. It is often said that everyone has at most one great idea, and if that's the case, mine was to recognize that there are powerful methods, tools, and techniques in computer and engineering sciences that could help uncover what's going on beneath the surface. Not being formally trained in these domains, I turned to others who were, and as a result, the Citizen Lab was born, both interdisciplinary and collaborative from the start. A colleague of mine once described what we do as a kind of MRI of the Internet, which captures the way network scanning, reverse engineering, and other computer and engineering science techniques peel back the layers of our communications ecosystem. But I've also been inspired by other more direct analogies. Since graduate school, I've been fascinated by the way government security agencies have for decades maneuvered through the communications ecosystem largely outside of public view thanks to classification and secrecy. Early in my career, I became familiar with signals and other electronic intelligence gathering, and was quite shocked to discover how some states had secretly developed sophisticated means and elaborate tools to intercept and monitor telecommunications and other network traffic. The U.S. National Security Agency and its partners in the Five Eyes Alliance, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, were doing so on a planetary scale. While marveling at this capacity, and putting aside legal, ethical, and other reservations, I wondered why a variation of it, based on open-source public research, couldn't be developed and used to turn the tables on governments themselves, to watch the watchers, and reveal the exercise of power going on beneath the surface of our communications environment. A mission was thus established for the Citizen Lab, and our interdisciplinary research came into focus to serve as counterintelligence for global civil society. There's an old saying that comes to mind, though, careful what you wish for. When we first began our work at Citizen Lab, we had no basis upon which to claim we were undertaking counterintelligence for anyone, let alone global civil society. But gradually the methods, tools, and techniques became more refined. Talented personnel were drawn to the mission and the freedom to explore challenging puzzles, the solutions for which had real-world consequences. Important collaborations developed, and the case studies accumulated. We found ourselves pulling back the curtain on unaccountable actions that some very powerful actors would rather we did not. Not surprisingly, those powerful actors did not just sit on their hands and do nothing, and we have found ourselves more than once in their crosshairs. Close to 2 decades of research, undertaken in collaboration with some enormously talented researchers, has helped inform my perspective on everything reported on in these lectures. Thanks to the work of the Citizen Lab, I feel as though I've been watching dark clouds forming on the horizon, and I, along with my colleagues, have been trying to raise alarm bells that this is not a good sign. A major aim of RESET is to help get us started thinking about how best to mitigate the harms of social media, and in doing so, construct a viable communications ecosystem that supports civil society and contributes to the betterment of the human condition instead of the opposite. It's cliched to say that the time in which one lives is a turning point, but looking around at the massive disruption to humanity's entire operating system, it is no exaggeration to say that we are in the midst of one. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, many existing institutions and assumptions were already under the microscope. So too is the case for social media. In order to move forward positively, we need to have a clear understanding of the nature of the problems in the first place. While RESET is conceived in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, its larger backdrop is the looming climate crisis and the existential risks it poses to human civilization. As environmental activist and author Naomi Klein has put it, humbling as it may be, our shared climate is the frame inside which all of our lives, causes, and struggles unfold. If it wasn't apparent before, it should be now. Nature is an inescapable force and the foundation for our very being. Pandemics, rising sea levels, melting ice caps, escalating surface temperatures show that we are all in this together, one species, one planet. The many different applications that make up our communications ecosystem will be integral to environmental rescue and ensuring the continued habitability of planet Earth. The internet and even social media hold out the promise of peer-to-peer communications on a global scale, essential for sharing ideas and debating our collective future. The myriad of sensors that span the globe, from satellites in near-Earth orbital space down to biomedical sensors implanted in our bodies, will be essential to taking the pulse of the planet's vast ecology, our own habitat included. Machine-based calculations undertaken at quantum scale can help us solve complex puzzles, increase efficiencies, and help predict and weigh the benefits of alternative trajectories. However, the time has come to recognize that our communications ecosystem, as presently constituted around surveillance capitalism, has become entirely dysfunctional to those aims. It's disrupting institutions and practices and unleashing new social forces in unexpected ways, many of which are having malign effects. Emergency measures now in place could turn superpower policing practices into totalitarian-scale population controls that quash individual liberties while creating unbridled opportunities for corruption and despotism. Runaway technological innovation for its own sake continues on a disastrous path of unbridled industrial consumption and waste, obscured by the mirage of virtuality. Leaving it as it is, with all of its intertwined pathologies intact, will all but ensure failure. A reset gives us a rare opportunity to imagine an alternative and begin the process of actually bringing it about. To be sure, it won't be easy, nor will it happen overnight. But fatalistic resignation to the status quo is no real alternative either.
You've been listening to Look at That Device in Your Hand, the first of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures by Ron Deibert. The entire lecture series will be on our website, cbc.ca/Masseys, and you can also download the podcasts from our podcast page. Your local or online bookseller will have the book of the lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, published by House of Anansi Press. And now that you've been listening to the lectures, we're inviting you to send us the questions you have for Ron Deibert. We'll be creating a special program to run with the rebroadcast of the series in March 2021. I'll be talking with Ron along with the guests you heard on the program, and we'll be discussing some of the questions you send us. So send your questions to masseyquestions@cbc.ca. That's masseyquestions@cbc.ca. Our partners in the Massey Lectures series are Massey College in the University of Toronto and House of Anansi Press. The Massey Lectures series is produced by Philip Coulter. Online production by Althea Manison, Andrew Nguyen, and Sinisha Jolich. Our web producer is Lisa Ayuso. Technical production, Danielle Duval. Senior producer, Nicola Luksic. The executive producer of the Massey Lectures and Ideas is Greg Kelly, and I'm Nala Ayed.